Hello and welcome to episode 22 of ListenIn. Our guest this evening joins us at the crack of dawn and all the way from Atlanta, Georgia. We are delighted to welcome Professor Manuel Prada from the Savannah College of Art and Design, known popularly as SCAD. Thank you, Manuel, for making the time in spite of this 13-hour difference that's separating us. Our conversation today is titled Virtual Reality Experts for Utilitarian and looks at the exciting terrain of VR technology that is reconstructing and altering our communicative, educational, and recreational environments. Professor Prada showing us the work that is presently done at SCAD with the focus on how virtual and augmented reality is being used to connect people to benefit industry and society at large. We will also see how VR is emerging as a tool not just for innovation and entertainment, but how it is turning into an empathy machine with the focus on its pro-social aspects. To introduce Manuel, he is a professor in the School of Digital Media at SCAD. His current concentration is the study of digital materials for offline and real-time rendering. In his 10 years as an educator, he has taught courses in immersive reality, game development, visual effects, and computer art. He also oversees collaborative projects with students at the university as well as external partners. Our discussion this evening will be for 45 minutes, followed by questions we will be addressing from our audience. Manuel, to begin, we know that virtual reality is a medium that provides us with the multisensory interactive platform that enables people to be present in a virtual environment, and to the extent where the body and mind believe that what is happening is real. It's a technology that draws on many senses. It uses audio, it uses visual, touch, smell. But as novices, how can we understand this technology, where it is at presently, and how they are applicable to us?
Thank you for having me today, Leandre. The focus of the talk today is about the sheer entertainment value that we know it has, obviously, in which is being used for video games or for movies or for a lot of different entertainment possibilities, but also about how it is being used for other more utilitarian things that are a little bit more related to real life and the practical purposes of real life. In regards to that, there are probably two big avenues for virtual reality proper, in which you can have scenarios for virtual reality in which you have full interaction with virtual environments, or scenarios in which you are just simply a spectator of something that's happening around you. And it typically engages maybe 2 or 3 senses, depending on how many senses it engages. That's the kind of experience that we may end up having. In a 360 video experience, only the sight and the ears are engaged. The viewer doesn't really interact with the environment. They are a spectator, but they can't really reach out and do anything. Whereas on more interactive virtual reality, which is the one that's accomplished with game engines in general, there is a possibility for the spectator to go out of their way and reach out and interact and cause effects in the environment in different ways. So in that sense, we do have multiple possibilities, not just for sheer entertainment, but also for things like education, training, labor, telepresence, being kind of like in another area where someone else is at a very long distance, miles away, but also being able to interact with that person in a much more intimate way, I would say. So that's a lot of what's going on out there. And I think I wanted to start by showing some of those possibilities in terms of what could be practical for it.
Also, Manuel, while you're starting the screen share, and we're looking at how VR is permeating into industry, healthcare, education, what is the value of it at this moment, and how do we navigate it? Like, what sort of relationship could we have with it? How is it restructuring the way we understand how things function?
Overall, the way to understand it, I guess, it really depends on the possibilities of whoever is trying to reach the technology. Some of the experiences that are available in virtual reality require high computation and a lot of hardware. Some other experiences are just kind of like on your own phone. 360 video is pretty much a staple of YouTube these days, and anyone with some kind of not even an expensive headset, but one of the really cheap plastic ones in which the phone can actually fit and cram in all of that VR content that's already available online, can access those experiences. The quality of the experience changes, obviously, with the more resources that are spent, but obviously it is something that's starting to become much more available. And it allows us to just like interact with multiple things or just simply be present for things in a different way. That's a little bit more engaged. There's a little bit more presential without necessarily having to be in there. So it does change the human experience a little bit more in the sense that it kind of gives us an idea of that presence without necessarily have to be that presence. It's not a perfect substitute, but it is quite close.
And in our discussions, and even the topic of today's conversation is looking at the utilitarian aspect of VR. And in our chats in the past weeks, you've talked about it in relationship to humanitarian issues. Does it really address real world problems like climate change or data privacy, mental health, or the refugee crisis for that matter? And how does it do so?
I think it offers a new perspective on a lot of different things. Being witness to something is not necessarily the same thing as doing something about it, right? So a lot of different things and issues that the world has these days probably require a little bit more engagement than just simply being aware of it. But being aware of it is part of the process. Being aware of it is like step number one. Just being able to see it and being able to kind of like, I'm not going to say experience whatever situation, but being a little bit more aware of it is the first part of the process in which the person can probably start recognizing some steps towards it, rather than just simply outright denying that the issue exists, right? So in terms of larger issues that are affecting the planet and humanity, definitely virtual reality can probably provide a window for people to see those firsthand in a closer kind of experience, rather than just simply kind of like reading it as a headline in the news and kind of like pass it as something that's not really happening.
Would you like to show us some of these examples?
Sure. I wanted to bring it to first the utilitarian aspect that we're seeing. And this example is from an application called ShareCare VR. And ShareCare is intended for medical visualization. The idea of this medical visualization is obviously for training purposes for health professionals, in which they can definitely see different angles, different aspects of the human body, and the different systems that exist with the human body. One really good thing about this application is that it also allows for the simulation of different conditions as well. So not only it's about visualizing how the organs or the body looks, but also different situations that could arise for those particular organs. In this case, as you can see, we can simulate, we can isolate different parts of the heart, but also different conditions could be simulated, in which if you want to know what heart arrhythmia looks like, instead of just kind of like reading it directly, you can see the difference in the rate of motion for the heart. You can see the contractions for the heart muscles in different ways, in a much more engaging, direct way, right? So it's not only for the human heart. The application has a lot of different uses for multiple kinds of muscle groups. And again, it does come with a lot of information and the possibility of altering that to see it in different ways. So again, super important, very, very utilitarian, and it's something that relates directly to the human experience in a much more practical way. It's training people to do something practical in real life. Another one, which is something that actually got me really interested in the technology initially, is architectural visualization. architectural visualization, since game engines started to get very, very proficient at handling light and materials like 6 years ago or so, it made it a possibility for us to just be able to see all of these virtual environments in a new light and just seeing them much closer. So the idea in here is that it's no longer just simply related to a game. It is something that can be used to visualize how an actual living space can be seen in different circumstances, which is one of the projects kind of like that I worked on in the past 5 years and that I'm going to be explaining today. The preferable methodology we use for this, in at least the projects that I have been working on, is the Unreal Engine. And it's about a lot of optimization and customization for materials and digital assets in order to get results that can look as realistic as possible when someone is planning on developing any kind of virtual scenario or any kind of architectural situation.
So you're saying, Manuel, that there's, sorry to interrupt you, but you're saying basically that there's a shift from the purely entertainment to this pro-social utilitarian aspect in VR. Is that so?
Yeah, and I think both aspects are very important. Essentially, entertainment is quite important these days. Everyone wants a little bit of entertainment these days. But at the same time, it is not the only aspect we should be focusing on for virtual reality. It's just one of the possibilities of how to use the technology. But the technology, it's not just to isolate yourself and kind of like replace reality. It can be used to bring reality a step closer to you when you don't have it right there in front of you.
And
Okay.
what about in terms of, but what about in terms of, say, human relationships, right? Because you're constructing this sense of reality. Like, for instance, now that we've all been facing different degrees of lockdown, we've all been huddled in our homes, but at the same time, we've had this spike of these, virtual reality experiences where we are able to visit museums or entire cities. Yeah, so how does that shape our experiences of things and countries and travel? And
definitely in these days, especially with travel restrictions and the limitations of mobility, there's a lot of experiences out there in virtual reality. And I think for a lot of them, all you need is kind of like a computer. You can actually go and see the wall of China in your own computer screen. Again, it's not the same as actually being there, but it gives you an idea of what it will look like. Whereas before, you will have no idea. You will just simply have heard of it and seen it in pictures. Being able to see it in 360 degrees gives you an idea of the magnificence, the actual size of the actual thing. And then museums as well. On Steam, actually, there's a lot of possibilities, or on the Oculus Store as well. There are applications for virtual reality that put you in museums in Europe, so you can actually see these art pieces from ancient masters, and you can actually get to like experiment them, getting closer to a wall. Obviously, it's not quite there, but they have really high quality scans of these paintings. They have really high quality representations of what they look like, sometimes done with photogrammetry, sometimes just done by taking pictures of it and letting the computer generate the overall profile of what it will look like. And you get to experience it like you are in a virtual museum. You get to see it up close to you. So it does help significantly with isolation in terms of, yeah, there are things that I don't think I'm going to get to see, but now maybe I can see them at a distance. And
when we,
yeah.
in terms of design, Manuel, is this still human-centric, or are we experiencing a shift?
Definitely, when you design for virtual reality, you have to design for humans. And there's a lot of factors and considerations that you have to take into account. You are designing for how someone is going to feel things, how someone is going to interpret those things. But aside from taking care of the feelings, the empathy component of the person that's going to be wearing the headset, because you are driving a story, you are driving a narrative, you are driving what they expect to see, what they expect to hear. what they are going to be interacting with. You are kind of like the architect of those things. But on another totally different side, there is the physical component, and is that our body rejects certain technologies when you have them at a different kind of distance from your eyesight than you're used to. It's very, very difficult for your eyes to have a screen in front of them and just tolerate that for a certain number of minutes if the technology and if the frame rate of those images is not the right one. It can induce nausea, it can induce sickness, and it can induce eye strain if it's not done properly. So aside from all of those things that we mentioned about the empathy component and about getting inside the head of the person that's going to be experiencing this, you have to think of their well-being physically, about their eye strain, about their nausea, about their general body disposition for the experience. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And that's only that what's happening on the face. Then people who are designing the interfaces to act around, to reach out things virtually, have to think about how that affects the range of motion for the person. If you are designing a virtual reality experience for someone playing bowling, you have to think about how that's going to affect the joints as well, the range of motion for where the menus are going to be. We are so used to having all of our menus right here in the computer within this little space that we don't really tolerate anymore that whole thing that Minority Report did long years ago of having interfaces super long like this. Everybody wants to seem like Iron Man with the helmet and kind of like look around everywhere and see interfaces everywhere. But practically, when we try it in virtual reality, that's super exhausting. So all of those things have to be taken into account. And that's just like, how does a human interact with this? And does it really work? Not only for the emotional, psychological component, but also for the physical component of a real human.
SCAD as an institution has been involved in groundbreaking projects, creating virtual reality experiences, not in the university, but also for industry. And in your journey over these past years, what has been the trajectory and the kind of research and work that you've been doing?
I think one of the things that SCAD has been doing is definitely exploring the technology and trying as many approaches that, sure enough, are based on entertainment, but also based on more practical approaches. I think one of the things that I kind of like wanted to show initially, kind of like to end that part of the conversation, was that there are not only utilitarian aspects to the use of virtual reality, but there's also more humanitarian aspects that allow you to kind of like get an idea of certain situations. This is also available on YouTube, and it's a documentary about refugees and the refugee crisis. And again, it's not the same as being in there, but it does give you an idea of how these situations transpire and what a lot of these things will look like from a different point of view of being there. What's the actual reality of it? So again, it's available to everyone. Even if you don't have a headset, you can actually see it in 360 and you can kind of like pan around and see it. The experience changes once you actually have it on your phone and you have some kind of like cardboard headset, something very practical, something that's not expensive, and you see it within that particular scenario. But that's an idea that goes beyond the utilitarian aspect, and it reaches and it hits a humanitarian aspect, which is again something that we kind of like wanted to touch, talking about what we have been doing with the university. The university recently worked, and recently I mean like in the last couple of months during the pandemic, worked on a virtual reality project for it's called VR for Good, and this was spearheaded by Terry Yarborough and Max Almy, who are kind of like one of the biggest components of the School of Digital Media. Max Almy is the dean, and Terry Yarborough is our head evangelist for virtual reality in the VR for Good. So the idea is this one was a project that was meant to outreach to people in hospice, to kind of like give people in hospice a little bit of comfort in final moments, trying to kind of like go outside of the constraining reality in which they are, kind of like replacing things a little bit with more comfortable environments and giving them an option of like looking at different areas of the world, looking at different possibilities. And just kind of like, it's something that does replace reality a little bit, but in some times, in some specific moments, that's something that you may actually want to do, right? So that's it's a project that the school worked on that I consider very important to point out and to actually kind of like demonstrate the next point that we're going to make. As far as how things started, for me at least, this was back in 2015. Back in 2015, as I mentioned, game engines started to become much more prominent with the possibilities for lighting, the possibilities for visualization in general, and that got me really interested in the technology. So back in 2015, one of the important projects that the School of Digital Media worked on for Savannah College of Art and Design was with Gulfstream Aerospace. Basically, the idea was to be able to customize, and let me just share in here. Basically, the idea was for us to be able to customize a cabin for someone that was going to commission an airplane. So private jets and private airplanes kind of like have to be designed for the interior of the cabin before they can be assembled in the factory. And for this project, let me see. For this project, we actually made it so that we will have the students going onto the actual factory and kind of like visualizing and understanding what will need to be done to customize the cabin of the airplane. In this case, the airplane has multiple components. It does have different kinds of advanced credences, and it has different configurations that are possible as well. So in this project, we worked with Suan Fu, who is the chair of the ITDM department at the school, and multiple students from multiple majors within SCAD. We had students from interactive design, students from visual effects, students from graphic design. We had sound designers, which is one of the greatest things about the school. We do have a wide pool of majors to choose from. And the sound design component was super important for everything we ended up doing in the project. So as for visiting the company, picking what will be the samples for different kinds of materials that will be used on the cabin that will be able to be switched and customized, it was super important to understand what the client wanted. What we were going to go for was an application in which the client will be able to just look at different possibilities and assemble the cabin and change the materials. So that's what we wanted. We wanted them to be able to look at the cabin virtually and assemble this. We were not thinking virtual reality when we started. We were thinking about an app. We were thinking about something that will happen within an application, like within a tablet. So the idea was that. And I'm going to just escape this momentarily. Give me a second, because I think I have a video in here that makes the point a little bit better. There we go. So this is kind of like what we wanted to see. The idea of an application that a client will be able to customize and see. Right? And this is just like our promotionals. This is how we wanted the whole thing to work. So that ideally the person will just simply be able to assemble or like visualize the projected cabin and then being able to see the results. We did work with the company in a very targeted way. The company shared with us geometry that they had scanned and modeled and made for their projects and for their airplanes. And then we had to kind of come up with a way of transferring that into interactive options. We had to experiment with reducing the geometry. Everything they gave us as far as assets were super heavy for us to be able to use in real time. So we had to take all of that stuff and we had to make it smaller. We had to make it more practical. and still keep all of the detail, because this is intended for people who can actually buy an airplane, and we have to convince them. So the idea was breaking down a lot of those geometries. At some point, and this is kind of like where I wanted to make a distinction, the app that we created became very functional, and this is what it looked like. And you can definitely see that having a graphic designer on the team helped significantly. The aesthetics of the design were quite good. At the same time, when we got to the part where we had the 3D portion of the project, we had the functionality for customizing different kinds of cabin configurations, with the couches in one area, with the credentials in another area. And we also were able to come up with the functionalities of customizing the materials. So if the client could look at that material and they wanted to change it for different kinds of texture or for different colors, they could do it. And they could do it also for the carpet, they could do it also for the walls of the plane and things like that. We were not quite convinced about how it looked. We thought that the look was not quite what we expected at that moment. And that's where the limitations of the tablet became very apparent. So this is where I wanted to kind of like make a strong distinction in between what it looks like in this particular point and when we started exploring virtual reality. When we started to explore virtual reality, the results were a little bit different. And you can see that for this component, now we have something that looks quite different. And the lighting situation, the materials look a lot more interesting. And again, this is not even in simulation mode. This is just simply kind of like looking at it within the game engine. When we're looking at it from this point of view, you can get a much better idea of what it would feel like to be in the cabin. And I think if I can just reduce the size of this, I can probably show you side by side. Okay, so this is what we're seeing.
Manuel. Sorry to interrupt, but go ahead. But it's really impressive to see, not just in terms of innovation, but also the collaborative approach that is, I think, quite intrinsic to content creation, correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it was all about collaboration, really. So we exist within these little pools of the majors, obviously, and I do teach in like 2 particular majors, but obviously having access to people that can do other things. Sound design was huge. And sound design for virtual reality, it's something that is intended to put you in the area. For the cabin, one of the selling points for the company is how minimal the sound is. It's intended to reduce jet lag as you're traveling from different points of the world to other points. So like the sound was an important component. We needed to have sound that didn't sound like anything, which is quite a conundrum. How do you represent that? How do you represent the idea of a lack of noise? So our sound designer had quite a task on their hands. And let me see, because I think the sound is important in this one. I share my screen, but now I'm going to share it with sound. So what you're hearing in there, it's one of our students, Danny Husher, and he ended up creating that idea of a sound, a leitmotif for someone that lives among the clouds for a good portion of their lives, going from one place to the other one, a little bit above the world. It's not the only one. He created multiple samples. And I'm just showing you right now the daytime version. Then how does light affect the cabin when it's nighttime as well? And this is the other way of seeing it. This is at nighttime, right? And in this one, we do have also another sound as well. And again, compare the possibilities of being able to see it in the headset to being able to see it kind of like with just the full functionality we have in here, but no lighting. So the materials look much nicer, and obviously it's just something that will take a little bit more development to fully implement all of those features, but it gave us an idea of what was possible. And again, this was back in 2015 when we were starting to work with all of these technologies and possibilities. Aside from that, it's like, it's not only just simply seeing it on the headset, we were also supposed to being able to see it in stereo. So it has to be done for two eyes. You can't just do it for one eye. You have to do it for two eyes so that one registers a little bit of an offset for what you're seeing, and the other one registers that moved by a couple of millimeters extra. So yeah, that's something that has to be also developed. The headset handles a lot of that stuff, but you have to think about it when you are developing that. Again, going back to the physical aspect as well.
Manuel, what about the urban visualization project that you had mentioned for people visiting, for new visitors to Savannah? And tell us about that project.
So when we finished working on this for a while, definitely we have now the idea of what was possible as part of the process. The client was very satisfied. And the next project that I worked on, which was like 2 years later after that, was based on the idea of urban visualization. Now, for this one, a previous class had been working with a company called Esri, and Esri generates software that can visualize entire cities from elevation points. So I think in this one I do have also, there we go. So City Engine by Esri is like the company that SCAD had been working with. And the idea was being able to use the software to visualize areas of Savannah, right? Again, this is a promotional of what the intention for it was when we were starting to work on it. And this was kind of like with the idea of augmented reality in play. So we worked with the company. The software allowed us to get some geometry for how the city would look from the top. And in the first part of the project, Professors Bridget Gaynor and Ari Cookson worked with the company to generate versions of the city that were based on that geometry. When I took on the project after that, we ended up exploring the city of Savannah from the point of view of someone coming to SCAD. So we used the project to kind of like give an idea to someone living outside somewhere in the world, a prospective student that's going to come to Savannah to get an idea of what the city looks like. So this was interesting to me because we really made this whole class about virtual reality. We made it so that this was all about the multiple technologies that could be employed for the process. So let's say in here, we have 3 different kinds of virtual reality in here. We have 360 graphics that are generated by the computer, obviously. And it starts with the person kind of like in the water, being able to look at the motion graphics for how the application will start. Just to give you an idea, I do have the 360 version in here. And when we see it from this point of view, you can see it from the point of view of a person, or you can look behind you with that sense of being in the water, right? So I can definitely kind of like just look around, and this is how we start. This is all rendered by the person. Then the next thing that we go into is the person switches onto that version of Savannah, and this is the geometry from City Engine. The prospective person looking at it will have the option of looking at the city from a bird's eye view, getting closer, looking at the names of the streets. And then we had multiple options. In this one, we really went a little far. We combined assets done in the game engine. We ended up creating some kind of system so that the person could find points of interest. So the buildings in SCAD, so they can get familiarized with those buildings. This one is the building for this was industrial design back at the time. These are the dorms, so that the student can get familiarized with how the dorms look. And this is all 360 photography. So we had to like also come up with how to do this. This is how Montgomery Hall will look like. This is the mailing center. So again, it's based on giving the person an idea of how these buildings look before they even get to the city, And there are multiple things in play in here. It's not just simply about the buildings, but also about the experience. So we also did something in here that I thought was super interesting, which was connect the important points in the city for restaurants and hotels. If you want a hotel, those are going to be signaled right here in green. And you can see all of those green areas right in here. And anything that was a restaurant is giving you the address of that restaurant, and it's telling you how far away and what's the actual rating for the restaurant as well. This is for hotels, the magenta ones. So greens are restaurants and magentas are hotels. Where can they be found? So again, something we considered important for people as a prototype to know when they're coming into the city. And then the other thing we considered important was to give an idea of what the events in the city are. It's a small town, but at the same time, there are very important points. So this one is River Street, for instance. And this is also combining 360 video with that option of being inside the 360 version of the city. The other one is Forsyth Park, and this one is Or Beach, Tybee, in which we had a Sand Arts Festival as well. So these are events that happen every year in Savannah. And just to give people an idea of what it is being immersed in that one particular point in time. They don't get to affect it. They don't get to interact with the people in there, but it gives them an idea. Now, where they do get to interact is with the buildings. They can actually look at the buildings from SCAD in different points of view. So we had to show them, and we had to actually have the students make buildings as well, create textures, create materials, and to have them in the app so that the prospective viewer can become familiar with what the library looks like, or with what Hamilton Hall will look like, or the Civic Center will look like. And they get to see them from multiple points of view. Important landmarks, all in downtown Savannah, so that they know the names and they know where they look like and what's the actual outcome or what's the actual position. And the other thing that we wanted to implement in here, aside from all the buildings, was the possibility of having different languages for people who will be coming into it. So there are multiple ideas in here. And I think for this one, the other thing that I wanted to show.
Manuel, I'm wondering, would a project like this become a citywide project for tourists visiting Savannah for your students?
Well, we wanted to. The main thing,
Possibility.
yeah, and something that I should have mentioned before I started kind of like showing all of our projects is that all of these projects that I'm showing you for what we have been working on happened in 2 months and a half. So we are super limited with the amount of time we have. We have only 2 months and a half to put together something like this. Now, the reality of interactive projects is that they may take 2 years or so to come up with the final version. But in our case, we only have 2 months and a half to make them work. So we wanted so many things for this. We really wanted a lot of things. You're asking me about the whole city. I wanted the whole city. We were only able to do downtown more than anything, and anything that's SCAD related. That's it. Aside from that, the university, we listed some possibilities for expansion in here. So having a social component where people can be in different parts and still have like that VR chat meeting, that is something we wanted to explore as well. The university has campuses in Atlanta, so we wanted to also show the campus of Atlanta. The university has also a campus in Lacoste in France, so we wanted also to show parts of Lacoste, France as well, so that people can get an experience for SCAD in all of the world, not just simply in Savannah as well. So definitely a lot of possibilities in here. And we wanted for this to be accessible to multiple languages, which is something that we tested and we implemented in a very partial way, just to show it as a proof of concept. The idea was that depending on the largest international groups that we had listed, Chinese, we had the largest population of Chinese students, of international Chinese students. We also had people from India a lot, and we had people from South Korea, Colombia, Venezuela, Taiwan. So the languages for the application to explain where we are at the moment were English, which is kind of like the standard for the application, but we also implemented some explanations in Chinese for people who are speakers of different kind of like languages. And the other one, for instance, we will have gone with India, for instance. We will also have that idea, but we kind of like came in the research with the realization that people from Spanish-speaking countries, in terms of the number of students we had, were larger as a group. So we ended up just implementing a couple of Spanish variations as well. Plus we had students that spoke the languages as part of the group. So that was easier.
And recently, your students won an award, I think, at SIGGRAPH, which is a major conference. Tell us about the whole experience that they created and show it to us.
All right. So we had this was this year in 2020, and we were commissioned by SIGGRAPH, which is an international conference for computer graphics, to make the presentation, make the virtual theater lobby. What's the virtual theater? The virtual theater is this particular event in which you have the best of the best VR submitted to SIGGRAPH, and it is all shown in this nice distribution that you see right in here. So you have this kind of like spiral setup where everyone is kind of like in a VR environment, and they're all connected, looking at all of these experiences, which is like the best of the best. What you're seeing is for 2019, and that's what SIGGRAPH did back in 2019. Now, in 2020, the university was expected to work on this and create kind of like a central hub where everyone can meet together and share these experiences and see them. The experiences go from 360 video to games to, there's multiple kinds of VR experiences in here. Now, this is where we came up with Tahul. And Tahul is the project that we worked on since the beginning of the year. And it does look something like this. Okay, so the idea is to kind of like put the viewer in some kind of sandbox environment. It's very based on Moroccan architecture and Moroccan decoration, and give them the option to play with elements, give them the option to affect their environment, to produce changes, to just use elements to affect changes in the environment in general. So again, we did this by using the Unreal Engine. We kind of like approached it in a very stylized way. But in the end, the idea of this is to serve as a lobby where we can show the virtual reality projects for all of the other submissions for virtual reality to SIGGRAPH. So in the end, the environment changes, these portals open, and from those portals, we go on to this virtual theater, which is kind of like in the desert with all of these gates that we will have around. I don't think we can see it in this one, but from here, that should give you an idea. This is where we end up looking at the candidates for the VR theater that year. So the viewer can actually experience it from here, just previews. You don't get to see the whole experience. You have to download them. And again, it contains multiple options for VR. The 360 options, it includes also the game engine options, but you get to pick which trailer you're going to see. The idea for what we were going to be working on was, again, what I showed in here. But in April, everything changed, and we had to pivot to work on something else. It was a big team of people. I had the privilege of working with Professor Ari Cookson again, and the team worked on a lot of the components that you saw here for the whole, plus also a lot of concept art and concept development. There was a huge process starting for how this was going to look, what kind of ideas, what kind of interactions we were going to have, what was the visual style we were going to have. So the students work really, really hard in all of this, and I think that will be available later on. But the idea is that conceptualization, all of these maps, mental maps of how different elements affect the environment, that all took a long, long time, when we realized also that what we wanted for this was not going to happen because the world was changing. We had to now move this whole process into something that will be more remote. We could no longer converge in one single location in one single center. This will have to become something that people from their houses could download and experience in their computers from isolation. So that's how the whole changed. The concept is still the same. The idea of the different visual styles and the idea of the different elements, the Moroccan architecture, all of those things remained. But we had to think about how to make this now be available to everyone in their own homes without actually attending a physical conference as well. So it was a whole process, and it was something that took some time, and definitely the collaboration of the SIGGRAPH committee, the collaboration of the students, again, Professor Cookson, who was the other counterpart on the project, it was all super important for this whole project to work out well. But in the end, the game, or not the game, the whole, the experience, it is now available in Steam, and has no price. It's not something that anyone has to pay for. It's just something that needs to be downloaded so that it can be experienced, and as kind of like an opener to what kind of virtual reality experiences the SIGGRAPH conference is offering for this particular year. So that's kind of like the general final version of what it's looking like right now. And as I was mentioning, there was a very, very long process to get to that point, multiple things. But yeah, it includes multiple options. It does include 360 video. It does include also technology for just game engine assets, 360 assets, textures, materials, a lot of different things that are part of the process too.
Manuel, could we see, before we finish talking about the projects, could we see the actual experience, the 2 to 3 minute experience that the students created?
So yeah, definitely something that you can see in there at the end of that one is the actual virtual theater, the virtual reality theater, in which you have all of the other virtual reality pieces around you, and you can go and choose and pick which one you should be looking at. And that's because at the time we put that together, the winners of the virtual reality theater had not been defined. So we just had to like leave placeholders in there to like be replaced whenever a winner was picked, to be able to be in that kind of like 12 or 15 winner circle.
Manuel, with all these projects that you've shown us, but not just within the university, but also in industry, what are some of the challenges that you've seen that VR faces at the moment? Is it related to access, in terms of providing access to the experience across social spectrum, or is it funding related, or both?
There are multiple challenges that are being experienced. Definitely the most prevalent challenge that happens is the hardware, and the idea of kind of like being tethered to a cable whenever you are experiencing it. Depending on what you're going for, you may need certain system requirements, certain kind of technology. So that used to mean that you need a very bulky computer. to be able to experience all these things. Oculus did come up with another headset that exists by itself, which you don't really have to be connected to a computer anymore. The quality of the experience may be slightly more basic compared to the one that you could have to be connected with a computer that's more powerful, but now the option is there. Now you can actually be detached from it. The graphics cards are also getting much faster, and they're getting much more powerful these days. So anything that is using a higher performance graphics card is going to also offer a better experience. The headsets are getting better at handling the frame rate for the eyes, but like still, that's technology that has to be developed. It has to be researched, and it takes work. This year, with everything that happened, you could see that production had stopped for a while. The availability of the headsets was not the same, and it kind of like they could not be ordered because factories in different parts of the world had to close with all the stuff that happened. So we do have the limitations of the hardware, the technology, and on top of everything that's happening, that also had to stop progress for a little bit. We are getting better now because we are getting a little bit more used to living with this situation. On the other hand, this technology also requires resources. So the same resources that are available to someone that has the expensive machine may not be available to absolutely everyone else in the world. And that's another thing. Socially speaking, for the technology to be more available to everyone, again, it does require access to the computing resources, and that may take some additional monetary resources that not everyone may have. But a lot of these can also be experienced with smartphones as well, albeit in a minor capacity. So pretty much like with cell phones and smartphones, it's just kind of like time to be able to have this technology in more places rather than just like in single localized hubs of activity. It is a process. It is just a matter of time.
And what do you think will be the future of VR in education? Do you think we'll start to see more schools and subjects that start to widely adopt VR in their classrooms? In fact, recently in Kerala, in state in India, you had some schools that already had VR technology in the classroom because that was the only way to connect to the students in their homes, in fact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And I will not have thought that it was going to be an immediate thing before 2020. I love being in the classroom. I love interacting with my students. I love moving from station to station, seeing what they're working on. But this year, like having this connection virtually and having to kind of like be able to empathize and reach out to another person without being in physical proximity, that became everything now. So that is definitely in the future of education. It is the fact that classes now being taught virtually, you do have to have that proximity. Sometimes when I am in a class and I am instructing a person on how to do something, I have to tell them to share their screen, press this button, move your mouse in here, and I have to annotate in the screen. If this class was happening in a virtual reality environment, I could just simply, with my controller, point out to the things that need to be moved. I could probably even go and move them myself just by using the controllers, because we will be sharing a virtual space. We will both be referring to the same thing instead of me giving instructions and commands verbally. So it will make things so much easier. And I can definitely see how the uses in the future could go that way.
It's still very surreal, though. I'm wondering how will that impact us socially? And you would know most because you've been in the industry, not just as an educator, but really studying perception and phenomenology and how to construct these virtual worlds for us, with your students in different in different sectors also. So yeah, how will that impact us?
There's always that question with any kind of technology that's going to be something new. I guess the most recent example to kind of like post aside from that kind of like a new technological revolution was smartphones, and how the moment everyone in the world started to have a smartphone, well, not everyone in the world, but most people in the world started to have a smartphone, the communication style changed, and the new cultural and society norms became different as well. These are things that have to be taught, and these are things that have to be kind of like explored as well. What is the new etiquette for kind of like being in a meeting with someone else where everyone else has a smartphone in their hands and they're just like not interacting with each other? What's the level of tension? What's the level of pressure for someone that is constantly bombarded with social media and announcements and things like that? So I think we have a lot to learn from the smartphone revolution to not make the same mistakes in virtual reality and augmented reality for that matter. As far as like being able to establish boundaries and limits, we are not walking blindly in here, because we know what happened with cell phones, and we know that we cannot go for the same mistakes. On my end of things, I think that if things are utilitarian for virtual reality, if it's not just simply about escapism, if it's not just simply about entertainment, people will still have a connection to the world around them. People will still have a way to interact with everyone else. Now, if all you're doing is just simply kind of like having different experiences that take you out to parallel worlds, and that's all you're doing for an extended amount of time, that's obviously going to be a bad thing. But how is that different than someone binging on Netflix for, I don't know, 24 hours without interacting with anyone else? Or someone playing video games for like 3 days straight? So it's not the virtual reality technology that poses the problem. It's the actual need for humanity to just like dive into entertainment at the expense of everything else. And if we're aware of the problem, we can take measures for it.
All right. Thank you, Manuel, for an exciting conversation on this completely new world that we are entering and we're somersaulted in. And thank you all our listeners for tuning in always. And I wish everyone a good evening. Thank you also to the SCAD team, and have a good evening. Bye.